The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, but the peace that followed was fragile, built on foundations of resentment and unresolved grievances. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in June 1919, was meant to ensure lasting peace. Instead, it planted the seeds of another, even more devastating conflict. The treaty imposed crushing terms on Germany. The nation lost 13% of its European territory and all of its overseas colonies. The industrial heartland of the Saar Basin was placed under League of Nations control. The Rhineland was demilitarized. Most humiliating of all was Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for the war. This moral condemnation was accompanied by reparations payments that would cripple the German economy for decades to come. The initial sum was set at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical figure equivalent to hundreds of billions in today's currency. Germans across the political spectrum viewed the treaty as a diktat, a dictated peace imposed by vengeful victors. The government that signed it, the fledgling Weimar Republic, would forever be tainted by this association. Veterans returning from the front, many of whom genuinely believed Germany had been on the verge of victory, felt betrayed. The myth of the stab in the back took root. The dangerous belief that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but had been undermined from within by socialists, communists, and Jews. This toxic narrative would poison German politics for years to come. The League of Nations, established with high hopes as a forum for international cooperation and collective security, proved toothless from the start. The United States Senate refused to ratify American membership, depriving the organization of the world's emerging economic powerhouse. The League had no military force of its own and relied on member nations to enforce its decisions. When aggression occurred, the League's response was typically limited to condemnations and ineffective economic sanctions. The organization's structure required unanimous decisions on important matters, making swift action nearly impossible. It became, in practice, a talking shop rather than an effective guardian of peace. The economic devastation that followed the war created fertile ground for extremism. Germany, already burdened by reparations, suffered catastrophic hyperinflation in 1923. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Life savings evaporated overnight. The middle class, traditional pillars of stability, saw their world collapse. Wheelbarrows full of currency were needed to buy basic necessities. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. This economic trauma left deep psychological scars on German society. The global economy seemed to recover by the mid-1920s, but the prosperity was built on unstable foundations. When the American stock market crashed in October 1929, the effects rippled across the world. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment soared. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. Similar scenes played out across Europe and America. The democratic governments seemed paralyzed, unable to provide solutions or even basic relief. People began looking for alternatives, for leaders who promised decisive action and national revival. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already seized power in 1922, capitalizing on post-war chaos and fears of communist revolution. He promised to restore Italy to the glory of ancient Rome. His fascist regime glorified violence, militarism, and absolute obedience to the state. Parliamentary democracy was swept away. Opposition parties were banned. Political opponents were beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Mussolini's regime became a model for other would-be dictators, proving that democracy could be overthrown and replaced with authoritarian rule. Japan's path to militarism took a different form but led to similar results. The military, never fully subordinate to civilian government, gradually gained dominance over Japanese politics. Ultranationalist officers promoted a vision of Japan as the natural leader of Asia, destined to free the continent from Western imperialism and create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese control. The reality, as would become brutally clear, was a system of colonial exploitation and military occupation. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party offered simple explanations for complex problems. Germany's troubles, Hitler claimed, were caused by the Treaty of Versailles, by Marxists and communists, by an international Jewish conspiracy. He promised to tear up the hated treaty, restore German honor, and build a new German empire. His message found a receptive audience among those devastated by economic collapse and humiliated by defeat. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within months, he had transformed Germany into a totalitarian dictatorship. The new regime moved quickly to consolidate power. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided a pretext to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act passed in March gave Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Political parties were banned. Trade unions were dissolved. Books were burned. Jews were stripped of citizenship rights under the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Concentration camps were established to house political prisoners. The machinery of a police state was assembled with terrifying efficiency. Hitler had always been clear about his ultimate goals. His book, Mein Kampf, written during his imprisonment after the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, laid out a vision of German expansion eastward, the acquisition of Lebensraum, or living space, and the subjugation or elimination of those deemed racially inferior. Most people, including many foreign leaders, dismissed these ravings as mere rhetoric. They would learn too late that Hitler meant every word. Germany began rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, Hitler openly announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and introduced military conscription. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized buffer zone between Germany and France. These were clear violations of international agreements, but the response from Britain and France was minimal. Neither nation was willing to risk war over what many saw as Germany simply moving troops into its own territory. This passivity sent a dangerous message. Aggression would not be opposed. The policy that would come to define the British and French response to fascist expansion was appeasement. The logic seemed reasonable at the time. The Treaty of Versailles had been harsh. Perhaps some German grievances were legitimate. Another war would be catastrophic. If reasonable concessions could maintain peace, surely that was preferable to conflict. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders convinced themselves that Hitler's demands were limited and that his appetite for expansion could be satisfied. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. Each concession only emboldened Hitler and convinced him that the democracies were weak and decadent, unwilling to fight. In March 1938, German troops marched into Austria. The Anschluss, the union of Austria and Germany, was accomplished without a shot being fired. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. Next came Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland, a region bordering Germany with a significant ethnic German population, became Hitler's next target. He claimed that Germans living there were being oppressed and demanded the territory be handed over to Germany. The crisis brought Europe to the brink of war in September 1938. Czechoslovakia, with a well-equipped army and strong fortifications, was prepared to fight. France had a treaty obligation to defend Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union had also pledged support, but Chamberlain flew to Germany to negotiate directly with Hitler. At the Munich conference in September 1938, Britain and France agreed to German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial demand. Czechoslovakia, not even invited to the conference, was informed that it must cede the territory or face Germany alone. Chamberlain returned to Britain waving the agreement and proclaiming he had achieved peace for our time. The relief was short-lived. In March 1939, Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, violating the Munich Agreement. The hollow nature of Hitler's promises was now undeniable. British and French policy began to shift. When Hitler next turned his attention to Poland, demanding the return of territory lost after World War I, Britain and France issued guarantees. If Germany attacked Poland, they would declare war. While Hitler prepared for war in Europe, Japan was carving out an empire in Asia through brutal military conquest. Japanese expansion had begun in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the action but took no meaningful steps to reverse it. Japan simply withdrew from the League and continued its aggression. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The assault on the Chinese capital of Nanking in December 1937 resulted in one of the war's worst atrocities. Over a 6-week period, Japanese troops engaged in an orgy of violence. Estimates of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war killed range from 200,000 to 300,000. Tens of thousands of women were raped. The city was looted and burned. The Rape of Nanking, as it became known, revealed the savage nature of Japanese militarism. The Chinese, divided between the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and the communist forces of Mao Zedong, nevertheless mounted determined resistance. The war in China would drag on for years, tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops. But Japan's appetite for expansion was not sated. Japanese leaders spoke of their destiny to dominate Asia and eyed the resource-rich European colonies in Southeast Asia. Italy, eager to build its own empire, invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The Ethiopian army, armed with outdated weapons, fought bravely but could not withstand Italian tanks, aircraft, and poison gas. Emperor Haile Selassie appealed to the League of Nations, warning that if the international community failed to act, no small nation would be safe. His words went unheeded. Economic sanctions were imposed on Italy but were too limited to have any effect. Ethiopia fell, and Italy absorbed it into Italian East Africa. Mussolini's prestige soared at home. The Spanish Civil War, which began in 1936, became a proving ground for the coming global conflict. When right-wing military officers under General Francisco Franco rebelled against Spain's elected Republican government, both sides sought foreign support. Germany and Italy sent troops, aircraft, and weapons to support Franco's nationalists. The Soviet Union provided aid to the Republicans. The democracies, fearing that intervention would spark a wider war, imposed an arms embargo that primarily hurt the Republican side. The war introduced the world to the horrors of modern aerial warfare. In April 1937, German aircraft supporting Franco bombed the Basque town of Guernica on Market Day, killing hundreds of civilians. The attack, immortalized in Picasso's famous painting, demonstrated that civilians would not be spared in modern war. German and Italian forces used Spain to test tactics and weapons they would employ in the coming World War. By 1939, Franco had won. Another democracy had fallen to fascism. As Hitler's demands grew more aggressive and Japan's war in China intensified, an unlikely diplomatic alignment took shape. Germany and Japan, along with Italy, formalized their relationship in the Tripartite Pact, creating what became known as the Axis powers. But the most shocking development came in August 1939, when Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological enemies, announced a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for the foreign ministers who signed it, stunned the world. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia agreed not to attack each other and, in secret protocols, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between them. The Baltic states and parts of Romania would fall under Soviet control. For Hitler, the pact removed the threat of a two-front war. For Stalin, it bought time to prepare Soviet defenses and offered territorial gains. For the rest of the world, it removed the last major obstacle to German aggression. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Using a new form of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war, combining rapid armored advances with overwhelming air support, the Germans smashed through Polish defenses. The Poles fought courageously, but were overwhelmed. On September 3rd, Britain and France honored their commitments and declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. But even as they declared war, Britain and France took little offensive action. The period that followed, known as the Phony War, saw virtually no fighting on the Western Front. France remained behind its supposedly impregnable Maginot Line fortifications. Britain sent an expeditionary force to France, but engaged in no major operations. In the east, Poland was crushed between German forces attacking from the west and Soviet forces invading from the east on September 17th. By early October, Poland had ceased to exist, divided between its two powerful neighbors. The inaction of Britain and France in those early months sealed Poland's fate and squandered the opportunity to challenge Germany when it was most vulnerable. Hitler had gambled that the democracies would not fight, or if they did declare war, would not fight effectively. Events proved him right. The pattern of appeasement had set. Each time aggression was left unchallenged, the aggressors grew bolder and the defenders more hesitant. The failure was not merely military or political, but moral and imaginative. Democratic leaders could not conceive that men like Hitler and Mussolini meant what they said, that they genuinely sought war and conquest, that they viewed peace as merely a pause to prepare for the next attack. The democracies assumed others thought as they did, that everyone recognized war as a catastrophe to be avoided. They projected their own values onto adversaries who held radically different beliefs. Economic factors reinforced this reluctance. Britain and France were still recovering from the previous war. Military budgets had been cut. Rearmament programs started too late and moved too slowly. Public opinion in both countries was strongly pacifist. Memories of the trenches, the millions dead for a few miles of muddy ground, made populations desperate to avoid another conflict. Politicians who spoke of standing firm against aggression risked losing elections. The Soviet Union, despite its later alliance with Britain and America, bore significant responsibility for the war's outbreak. Stalin's purges of the Red Army in the late 1930s removed thousands of experienced officers, weakening Soviet military capability. His non-aggression pact with Hitler gave Germany a free hand in the West. Soviet supplies of raw materials, including oil and grain, helped fuel the German war machine in the early years. Stalin's cynical calculation was that Germany and the Western democracies would exhaust themselves fighting each other, leaving the Soviet Union to pick up the pieces. He would pay a terrible price for this miscalculation. The United States, protected by oceans and focused on its own economic recovery, maintained strict neutrality. Isolationist sentiment ran strong. Congress had passed neutrality acts designed to keep America out of foreign wars. Many Americans believed that involvement in World War I had been a mistake and were determined not to repeat it. President Franklin Roosevelt, more internationalist in outlook, was constrained by domestic politics. America would provide moral support to the democracies, but little else, at least initially. The failure of the League of Nations was now complete. The organization had been tested repeatedly through the 1930s and had failed every test. It could not stop Japanese aggression in China. It could not reverse Italian conquest of Ethiopia. It could not prevent German rearmament or expansion. It could not forestall the outbreak of general war. The dream of collective security through international cooperation lay in ruins. The world would have to learn through bitter experience that aggression unchecked only grows bolder. The period between the wars had been marked by economic catastrophe, the rise of totalitarian ideologies, and the failure of democratic nations to respond effectively to clear threats. The Treaty of Versailles had created grievances without providing mechanisms to address them peacefully. The League of Nations had embodied noble ideals but lacked the power to enforce them. Economic depression had created desperation and made populations susceptible to extremist appeals. Appeasement had sent the message that aggression paid. The war that began in September 1939 would eventually engulf the entire globe. It would be fought on 6 continents and all the world's oceans. It would see the deaths of perhaps 70 million people, the majority of them civilians. It would witness atrocities on a scale previously unimaginable, including the systematic murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. It would end with the use of atomic weapons and the dawn of the nuclear age. The world that emerged from the war would be utterly transformed, but all of that lay ahead. In September 1939, as German panzers rolled through Poland and Britain and France declared a war they were not yet prepared to fight, the world stood at the precipice. The seeds planted in the bitter peace of 1919 had grown into a harvest of destruction. The failure to confront aggression early, when it might have been stopped, meant that confrontation would now come at catastrophic cost. The democracies had hesitated, hoped, and compromised. Now they would have to fight a war that might have been prevented. The road to World War II was paved with missed opportunities and fateful choices. At numerous points, different decisions might have altered the course of events. Harsher enforcement of the Treaty of Versailles might have prevented German rearmament. More lenient terms might have prevented the resentment that fueled Hitler's rise. Earlier confrontation of German expansion might have stopped Hitler before he became too strong. Collective action through the League of Nations might have deterred aggression. None of these happened. Instead, the world stumbled toward conflict, propelled by economic crisis, nationalist fervor, ideological extremism, and the failure of leadership. The lessons were stark and would shape the post-war world. Aggression must be confronted early. Appeasement of dictators only encourages further demands. Economic stability is essential for political stability. International institutions need real power to enforce their decisions. The defense of democracy requires vigilance and sometimes sacrifice. These principles, purchased at terrible cost, would guide the reconstruction of the international order after 1945. But in September 1939, those lessons were yet to be learned. The war had only just begun. The worst was yet to come. If this story moved you, please hit that notification bell, subscribe, and share this history with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us what you think.